For the first time, an AI has run a whole ransomware attack by itself, according to the security firm Sysdig. No hacker at the keyboard. It broke in, stole the data, encrypted more than 1,300 records, and wrote its own ransom note. But here's the claim I'll stand by today. The same autonomy that just made that crime nearly free is making defending against it nearly free too. Come with me, let's get into it. Threat researchers at a company called Sysdig documented something new. Nobody had seen it before. An AI agent ran a complete ransomware operation start to finish with no person at the keyboard. They named it JadePuffer. And this is what the agent did on its own. It swept a compromised server. It moved sideways across the network. It stole the data, and it encrypted more than 1,300 configuration records on a database. And then it wrote its own ransom note. The whole extortion lifecycle, the part that used to take a skilled human days of patient work, handled by software in minutes. And looking into exactly how the model executed this is almost eerie. Sysdig decoded the payloads, and in their words, they were saturated with natural language commentary explaining why each action was taken. The model narrated its own attack as it went, and at one point it hit a code error and fixed it in 31 seconds. Now, let me be really careful about what's actually new here because the break-in itself was fairly ordinary. The agent got in through known, already published flaws in an open-source tool called Langflow. It worked from credentials stolen in an earlier breach, and a human still chose the victim, stood up the infrastructure, and handed the agent its opening. So this wasn't a machine just waking up and deciding to rob someone. The story, though, is the economics, and here's how Sysdig put it, and I want the exact words, so I'm going to quote them. The skill floor for running ransomware has dropped to whatever it costs to run an agent, and if that agent is running on stolen credentials through LLM jacking, the cost to an attacker is close to zero. That's the full quote. LLM jacking is that last piece they mention. You run your agent on someone else's stolen API key so that you don't even pay for the compute. And in this haul, the loot included stolen keys for OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepSeek, and Gemini. The agent stood up those keys along the way. The engine was elsewhere. Microsoft's Jeff McDonald assessed it, and he figures that the operation most likely ran on open source models with the safety layers stripped out. So here's what to take from this. It cuts both ways. The thing that made this attack cheap is autonomy, an agent that plans, acts, and finishes without supervision. That exact property is arriving on the defensive side as well. Anthropic, for example, says its own security agents have been scanning open source code for weaknesses before an attacker can find them. For most of history, real security was scarce and expensive. You needed a skilled team, and that priced out the clinic, the water utility, the small firm, etc. When the cost of a watchful agent falls to near zero, so does, of course, the cost of guarding against every one of those vulnerabilities. Now, the offense showed up first because it doesn't ask for permission and there is no rollout, but the defense comes through the front door, knows the lay of the land, and is increasingly integrated into the places that could never afford the guard before. Now, let's shift over to who's trying to put rules around agents like that and how fast that is moving. 3 governance moves landed in a single news cycle at 3 completely different altitudes and locations: a state house, a national cabinet, and the United Nations. Start in Illinois. On Monday, July 6th, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed S15 into law. People are calling it the strongest frontier AI law in the country. This is what it does. Starting on January 1st of 2027, any company with more than $500 million in revenue that builds one of these big frontier models has to submit to independent third-party safety audits. Penalties for this reach $3 million, and it defines a catastrophic risk line, 50 or more deaths or $1 billion in damage, and it requires companies to report a serious incident within 72 hours. Now let's look at how it passed. The Illinois House voted 110 to nothing to pass it. The Senate 52 to 5. We covered this on a previous edition of the Century Report, you might remember. OpenAI and Anthropic both back it. So, who fought it? An industry group called TechNet, and they fought exactly one provision of it, the independent auditor. And that's important. An audit a company runs on itself is merely a claim, but an audit it can't control can be taken as evidence. The whole fight was over which one the law would require. But there's more on this Illinois law and where this is heading in today's Century Report. Second location, Australia. On Tuesday, the country's Assistant Technology Minister Andrew Charlton spoke at a Sydney safety forum. He said that AI models are already, this is his words, cheating, deceiving, and going their own way. He pointed to a finding from Anthropic last year that a model resorted to blackmail in 96% of a certain set of trials, and I emphasize those were trials. That number really needs context because the headline version is actually scarier than the truth of what really happened. That result came from a simulation deliberately built to give the model no other path to its goal. So corner anything hard enough, and of course it does desperate things to finish the task. So read that as goal-seeking under pressure, game theory, not necessarily menace. Australia's approach, by the way, is different from Illinois. No single AI act. Instead, it runs existing law across the whole government through a dedicated safety institute led by Dr. Kate Conroy. Third location and the highest altitude. On Monday, the first government-level UN Global Dialogue on AI Governance opened in Geneva. Secretary General Guterres put it really plainly. If AI is to be powerful, it must be governed. And the numbers in the room framed the stakes. The United States holds a leading share of the world's top 500 supercomputer compute, though China now operates the single most powerful system. And let's look at the pace, too. The internet took 15 years to reach 1 billion people. AI got there in 2. So this is what all 3 of those stories tell me. A legislature, a cabinet minister, and a multilateral hall all moved in the same week. No one is claiming the problem is solved, but the accountability floor is being poured from several directions at once by the various governments closest to the people that this technology reaches. The old assumption was that whoever owns the compute writes the rules. A binding third-party audit, a safety institute, and a 40-expert global panel are all built to take that assumption apart. Now over to a very different kind of AI autonomy, one pointed at the machine itself. Anthropic, as you know, has released Fable, and it just wrote the fastest megakernel that anyone has ever submitted to a benchmark called Kernel Bench Mega. Quick translation on that. A GPU kernel is a small program that runs on the graphics chip, and it does one specific piece of computation. How good those kernels are decides how efficiently every AI model runs on that hardware. Writing fast ones has been one of the most specialized corners of the whole field, a handful of experts handcrafting performance that everyone else depends on. Fable's result was an 18.71 times speedup over the standard optimized baseline, nearly 19 times faster. And here's the leaderboard difference. Fable is at 18.71, Claude Opus 4.8 is down at 14.4. The Chinese open-weight model GLM 5.2 is at 11.14, and GPT 5.5 is all the way down at 4.34. So Fable beat every other system in the field by more than 4 points at least. What Fable built is called a megakernel, a single cooperative launch that handles a full token's worth of computation. And that is genuinely hard, by the way, for human engineers. Normally, engineers split that work across dozens of separate launches, each one carrying its own overhead. Fold them into one, and you have to reason about memory, scheduling, and synchronization all at the same time. So Import AI's framing on this was blunt. Fable found a configuration faster than anything a person had ever checked in. So here's why it reaches beyond just the benchmark numbers I mentioned a second ago. This is an AI improving the machinery that AI itself runs on. Faster kernels mean more computation per watt per second, which lowers the cost of every model that inherits them. A self-improvement loop made concrete. Now, let's be honest, going in both directions here. The frontier is uneven. On another benchmark, Osworld 2.0, which tests long, multi-step agent tasks, the best system still only manages 20.6% accuracy. So narrow, verifiable engineering is where these agents really shine for now. General open-ended agency is still a steep curve, and this win comes with a price tag as well. Anthropic just signed a roughly $19 billion 20-year lease for 400 megawatts of power in Kentucky to run agents like this at scale, which is exactly where the next story picks up. So let's follow that power line into the grid, the courts, and a heat wave. A new study from Kayest in South Korea put a number on what these agents cost to run. An agentic system, one that plans, calls tools, and iterates instead of just answering in one shot like a traditional chatbot did, can burn up to 136.5 times more energy per query than a single pass model. It averages 348 watt-hours a task, and a big reason is waste. The GPUs sit idle up to 54.5% of the time, just waiting on the next step while the agent thinks. Now scale that across 13.7 billion or thereabouts daily requests. The researchers model roughly 198.9 gigawatts of draw, close to half of all current US electricity generation. Now, That's a warning about inefficiency, not a fixed destiny. Obviously, power is improving and so are the models. And you already heard the answer to that in the last story. Fable's 18.71 times kernel speedup is exactly the kind of low-level work that reclaims that idle time. The appetite and the cure are both advancing on the same track, parallel to one another. Meanwhile, the build-out keeps going. In that Kentucky deal I mentioned, Anthropic signed that $19 billion over 20 years with TeraWulf. That's the name of the company for up to that 401 megawatts. It comes online through 2027 and 2028. And here's where the world it's landing in starts to push back from three directions at once. The grid obviously pushes first. In North Carolina, Duke Energy reversed its earlier stance and proposed what's called a large load tariff. The idea, any customer pulling more than 50 megawatts has to pay a minimum bill for at least a decade so that demand doesn't land on ordinary households. Duke raised its 2035 demand forecast to 8 gigawatts and used it to justify nearly 10 gigawatts of new gas. And hearing opened on an 11.6% residential rate increase, and more than 75 tariffs like Duke's are now moving across about 35 different states. The courts are what push next. In Sturtevant, Wisconsin, 3 residents filed a class action on July 1st against Microsoft over its Fairwater data center. They point to the diesel generator noise, the chiller hum, the construction dust, and pollution. Now, Microsoft does say that the fixes it made earlier this year already resolved those complaints, but that's the company's account. And then there are the physics pushes. On June 27th, a heat wave knocked the UK's Dawn supercomputer offline when its cooling failed at Cambridge. Power didn't come back until July 6th. The same heat pushed a Portsmouth hospital into a critical incident as Britain hit a record 37.7 degrees Celsius, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So here's how I read all of it. You put these 4 different things together and you don't get a wall in front of progress. Instead, you get the transition, negotiating its own terms out in the open. The old assumption was that compute could treat public power as a bottomless input that somebody else had to cover. Once the cost attaches to the builder, though, through a tariff, a lawsuit, or a heat wave, efficiency stops being optional and becomes the cheapest strategy there is. Pricing the appetite is what funds the cure. All right, let's bring it home. One property ran underneath almost everything today. An agent that can plan, act, fix its own mistakes, and finish a job with nobody at the keyboard. That's what ran the ransomware attack in our first story. It's what wrote the record-breaking kernel in the third story. And it's the thing that 3 governments spent this week trying to get their arms around. And it's what's straining grids from Kentucky to Cambridge. The reason that the attack surfaced first is simple. That offense, those attackers, they don't ask for permission. There is no rollout, no procurement, and no sign-off. So the frightening version of a new capability almost always seems to arrive before the useful one. But watch where the useful version is going, the defense. The same autonomy that broke into a server is turning inward to make every model cheaper to run. And the accountability meant to hold all of it, we're pouring it from 3 directions at once: a binding audit in Illinois, a safety institute in Australia, a global panel in Geneva. That is the thing to walk out with here. The cost of doing almost anything with intelligence continues to collapse, and it collapses for the guard, the builder, and the auditor just as fast as it did for the attacker. Sure, it did seem that the frightening edge showed up first, but it came through the back door. The rest is arriving right behind it and through the front door. We'll see you tomorrow.